We have a new coach for the New Orleans Saints, and it's somebody who's going to have a Super Bowl ring pretty soon. I'm Frank Schwab. She's Jori Epstein. We are going to talk about everything in the NFL, including the Eagles, the Super Bowl win, and all the changes in the NFL. It's inside coverage. So Jori, Kellen Moore, he's New Orleans Saints coach. The last time we saw Kellen Moore, he was absolutely eating up Steve Spagnuolo's defense. How do you like this hire for the Saints? And just what do you think of Kellen Moore as a head coach going forward?
In New Orleans for the Super Bowl, we were increasingly trending in this direction. Everyone went into this week thinking that Kellen Moore would become the Saints' next coach. And I even asked Eagles team owner Jeffrey Lurie in the post-game locker room, do you expect to lose Kellen Moore this week? And he said, yes, I do. I expect to lose him to the New Orleans Saints. We'll have to wish him well there. He's been amazing at changing our game plan from week to week, as well as a wonderful person. So I think the Eagles were prepared for this. The Saints were prepared from this. I had sources on both sides throughout the week telling me this was what the expectation was. And now the other expectation was always that Kellen was not just going to stay there. First of all, from a family standpoint, his wife and kids are still in Philly. You got to go home and get your stuff, even if you're not staying long. And there was also an expectation, we'll see if that holds up, that Kellen would be a part of the parade. It's just a few days. He's going to be hiring his staff, et cetera. So we'll see if that continues to be the case. And if he maybe goes to New Orleans for an introductory press conference, goes back for the parade. There are a few different things to balance here, but I think the New Orleans Saints are getting a really bright offensive mind, an offensive play caller who not only morphed the Eagles' plan from week to week, but he's morphed to each of the teams that he's been in. I've reported on Kellen Moore pretty extensively over the last couple months. I covered him in Dallas as backup quarterback, quarterback's coach, and offensive coordinator. So I've really seen Kellen through a lot of stages, as well as visiting him at training camps, et cetera, with the Chargers and the Eagles. And when I think about Kellen, I think of someone who, hey, if he's got a quarterback who he feels like that's the best way to win, he will let that guy light it up and create some, whether it's use of tempo, that's a really big thing for Kellen, or misdirection to help the play to get started. That's what Kellen will do. But when he has a running back like Saquon Barkley, or even the year that he had Ezekiel Elliott and Tony Pollard on the Cowboys, he will go with that. And he's not afraid to say this is the best way to win. So I think that you hear schematically from really all of the players who have worked with him, from offensive line to quarterback, how much they appreciate the level of detail that Kellen gives them. And then interpersonally, Kellen is someone who, he's not loud, he's not brash. I mean, expect him to sort of rely on other members of his staff for that degree. But an executive who interviewed him for a coaching position in a recent cycle, it was a head coaching position, told me that they believed that Kellen has the emotional intelligence to connect with the room. So as I said on the podcast last week, he might not demand respect, but he will command respect. And I think we see, whether it's Andy Reid or Bill Belichick, again, I'm not comparing Kellen at this stage in his career to those guys, but neither of those guys walked in the room screaming and Dan Campbell hulking presence. You are able to lead a room. And so to me, the biggest question, Frank, that I would love to hear your opinion on is, what do you do with this Saints job? I mean, this is not a strong job. There are definitely people who were aware of this coming decision who said, at some point, you're just ready to be a head coach. And Kellen is ready for that. And he has that opportunity. So he should take it, one of 32, et cetera. But this is not a job like whether it's the Cowboys or the Bears, where you have a lot of the infrastructure already in place.
Yeah, it's one of those things where I think it's a good hire for the Saints. Obviously, really nobody else wanted this job for obvious reasons. There's no quarterback solution.
Do we
There's
know
a lot
that?
of cap
Because
problems.
I just got to be clear. Mike McCarthy did not interview. He didn't turn them down. They never interviewed him.
No, that's true. No. You are correct about that. And it seems like the Saints just honed in on Kellen Moore pretty quickly. And I think it is. Look, we don't know how the hire is going to turn out, but you can only judge the process. And I think it's a good hire. Now, it's funny about Kellen Moore because we do end up talking a lot about, can he be that leader? Can he be that? I remember this is way back in the day, right? I'm covering Mountain West football. I'm at Mountain West Media Days, and Kellen Moore walks by me. And if you've ever been around Kellen Moore, as you have, he's one of the more unimposing people you could ever be around. Like, he's just that dude in the crowd. And I'm like, and in my mind, I remember thinking, like, that guy is one of the best quarterbacks in college football, and there's nobody in this entire place who would realize it just walking by him. Like, you're right. He's not the Dan Campbell hulking type, but I do think there's different ways to coach in the NFL. There's different ways to be successful. I think Kellen Moore's way is being that calm, steady presence who is, hey, I'm going to get you prepared. I'm going to have you ready to go. Schematically, we're going to be very, very good. And a calm presence is not a bad thing in the NFL sometimes either. Like, it's a very chaotic world at times. So I think he could be an even keel guy. And again, there's different ways. You don't have to be Dan Campbell type to be a great head coach. You don't have to be a Vince Lombardi type to be a great head coach. You could be a Kellen Moore. And so I really think that the only thing I worry about is he's going to get patience on this job, because it's going to take patience. You can't go into this job saying, if they go, let's say the bottom absolutely falls out and they win 6 games in 2 years, that, oh, you got to go now. I don't think that's the way you could treat Kellen Moore in this job. I think he needs time. I think the Saints' job is bad. They have a really aging roster in many key spots. Derek Carr is just kind of who they're stuck with for now. Let's be honest. I don't think Derek Carr's a terrible quarterback by any means, but he's clearly not like the answer there either, if he's even around. And they have cap issues. So I think the big thing for Kellen Moore is he given patience? And also, is he allowed to be himself? Because we're going to talk a lot about his personality. You just allow him to be who he is. I think he could grow and be a great head coach. I really do. And I think this is a good fit for the Saints. But again, it ain't going to be pretty early. I think you'd agree with me there, right?
Yeah, I think you're totally right. And when I look at this, I say, if Kellen Moore and the Saints don't work out, I think that will be more on the Saints than Kellen Moore. Obviously, we'll have to see what's going on, and it's early, and I'm also a little bit predetermined to have bias toward Kellen in the sense that I understand and have been around the reasons that he has succeeded. But when I look at this, one of the reasons that you saw Ben Johnson allegedly want to bring in a GM in Chicago, or you see in Jacksonville, Liam Cohen wasn't willing to go there with Trent Baalke, is not just, hey, I don't like working with that guy. It's a head coach and GM can often operate more smoothly if they are on the same timeline. And Mickey Loomis and Kellen Moore, not on the same timeline. Of course, anyone would want to win right away. No one doesn't want to win. But Kellen Moore is probably pretty realistic of, hey, it's going to take some time and probably some growing pains, and we're probably not going to have a Commanders-like year in year one. And then on the other hand, you have Mickey Loomis, who he's been there a while, he wants to win, and he doesn't, from what I understand, believe that they are in a rebuilding period. So that is going to be the question of how much can you get the building on the same page of, what are your expectations for this year? Great if you exceed them, but what are realistic expectations? And how can you build a contender to win in the next 2, 3, 4 years? And I think going back to Aaron Glenn was someone who the Saints were really interested in, and he ends up taking the Jets job. And when I talked to executives at the Senior Bowl about the Aaron Rodgers situation, which, as we know, there's a little more clarity on since we last met, they said that the top reason they wouldn't want Aaron Rodgers back was not because of the culture, not because of the distractions. It was because they would want to go ahead and build an offense around the quarterback or the quarterbacking style that would long-term set up the team for success. And they'd rather lose more in year one and win in year two, because you see when the opposite happens, like Brian Dable, another one who is ahead of schedule, when you then don't win the next year, you've created a new expectations. You've created a new threshold. I mean, we'll see that with the Commanders. I'm not so concerned about Washington because I think they have a lot of things going for them, including Jaden Daniels, Cliff Kingsbury, Dan Quinn. We could go on and on. But teams that win in the first year are not always better off if they can't sustain it. You want your trajectory. It's not only a what have you done for me lately league, but also have you improved and have you set the owner's expectations realistically. And so if you're Kellen Moore and the Saints, the goal of your first year, your top goal should be to create a system that will maximize your ability to win in years 2 and 3. It should not be just winning in year 1.
Now here, let me ask you, what has been the theme of all this coaching cycle? It's been guys want their own GM, right? Like a guy they can work with, a guy they know, they're on the same page, they come in together. As you pointed out, Loomis and Moore are not really aligned here, not as far as their philosophies or all that, but just their timetable. Like Mickey Loomis probably isn't thinking 5 years down the road. I don't know if the Saints have that kind of patience for him. Do you think there's a mistake to have this pairing? Should they have just cleaned house? I think they probably should have, because I think with the Saints specifically, they need to get out of this mode of we're just going to get the credit card out and push all the cap hits to the future, and we're going to chase being 9-8 and hope the NFC South stinks. Like that's what they're doing right now, and it's not getting them any closer to a championship. I don't know that Mickey Loomis thinks he has the job security to reset this and go 3-14 next year if that's what it's going to take. Do you think it was a mistake just to not reset the whole thing with the Saints?
I think what's important to recognize here is that there are different general manager structures in the league, and there are general managers that are hired. There are general managers that are general managers in title, but head coaches are actually the ones making the final roster decisions. And then there are general managers who have been there a long time and who have done something like win a Super Bowl, like Mickey Loomis has, who basically become a part of the ownership structure. That's what Mickey Loomis is in New Orleans. When you talk to people close to that building, he has an ownership-like degree of stability isn't the right word, but influence is. And so I think that the idea of resetting him, it's like, well, it's kind of up to him whether he wants to reset him, because that's the amount of power that he has. And so do I think that
right.
they would have been better if they brought in two people, especially if, hey, Mickey Loomis doesn't stay forever? Yes. I don't know that it's a job security question for him, though, because I think the Saints have given him pretty significant leeway to have the job security he wants. And hey, maybe that changes. Maybe Gail Benson decides in a year or two that that's not working for her anymore. But at this stage, that is my understanding of the Mickey Loomis structure.
Now, real quick, you brought up the magic words, and the bosses would electroshock me if I didn't ask a follow-up question. You did bring up Aaron Rodgers. There is more clarity on that situation, because I do want to ask you real quick. Okay, Aaron said it's not going to work. The Jets have said we're moving on, right? 2 questions for you. Does Aaron play, and where? And who the heck is the Jets quarterback week 1? Because I think, here, real quick, Jori, I think there's a mistake. Because I think the Jets, okay, I get the drama, I get the baggage, I get all that. But whoever the Jets quarterback is week 1 is not going to be as good as Aaron Rodgers. I can almost promise you that. Unless they have some plan that I can't fathom right now. I think Aaron Rodgers played well at the end of the year. And I think he gave Aaron Glenn a chance to get off on the right foot in year 1. It's not a long-term thing, but all right, Aaron's our quarterback. This year will we figure it out? Now, maybe this is all mutual. I get that. So, A, where does Aaron play next year if he does? And 2, who is the Jets quarterback week 1 out of any reasonable candidates?
Jets quarterback week 1. Wow, that is a question. Let's start with Aaron Rodgers, which I look at teams and I say, who values what Aaron Rodgers can bring maybe more than other people around the league? And so there are some teams who say, hey, we've never had this quarterback. We don't know what it's like to have a quarterback with Aaron Rodgers' arm talent. We may not go that direction. But when I look at the way that Mike Tomlin in Pittsburgh talked about what Aaron Rodgers did last season, I think they'll at least explore it. I mean, they explored Russell Wilson. Aaron Rodgers will not be as cheap as Russell Wilson or Justin Fields, but I also think you have to recognize that the Pittsburgh dynamic is such that even if offensive coordinator Arthur Smith wants Justin Fields to be the quarterback, that doesn't guarantee it to Justin, because I believe that he wanted him to be the quarterback this past year. And Mike Tomlin gave it to Russell Wilson. And so if Mike Tomlin decides, hey, I want this level of quarterbacking play, he has, again, going back to what Mickey Loomis has, Mike Tomlin has that above coach status in terms of the ability to bring in the roster. I also look at the Las Vegas Raiders and say Tom Brady appreciates that degree of arm talent and that degree of quarterback success in a different way. And so if you're Tom Brady and you have a lot of influence in that organization, I know we've talked about that on the show, but whether it was at the Senior Bowl or Super Bowl, conversations with people definitely continue to be pretty unanimously in belief that Tom's influence is extremely significant and powerful in that Raiders building. I don't think Tom Brady wouldn't want to explore the opportunity. Again, is it the answer this year? No, but they don't have a direct route to drafting a quarterback. And so maybe it's a Sam Darnold type, but if I'm Tom Brady, I think I'm more interested in Aaron Rodgers as a short-term solution than Sam Darnold. And I also think that a quarterback like Tom Brady just can't stand the interceptions that Sam Darnold had at the end of the season. And so I do think, and I've talked to people around the league who believe that Sam's value did change from this week, which is a bummer for him. I'm rooting for him because it's a great story and he's a good dude. But I also think that that is going to stick in the mind of someone like Tom Brady.
Absolutely. You avoided it. Who's Jets quarterback week 1? I have no answer. I that's why I think the Jets are absolutely going to stink this year. I'm looking at betting us. Like who? Like Kirk Cousins? Why would he want to do that? But you're taught like this.
I think they draft a quarterback. The question is, are you like drafting the 4th
quarterback off the board like that? Like we've already talked about. Any of the quarterbacks in this draft probably would have been drafted 7th last year behind Bo Nix.
Right.
So you're taking a guy who would have been the 9th, 10th best quarterback of the 2024 class. Like that just does not seem to be a good path to success for me.
I think it also depends. I don't have an understanding of what Aaron Glenn and Darren McGee want as their quarterback.
That's true, too.
Let's say they get a free agent bridge. Do they want Justin Fields style or Daniel Jones style? Because they have very different styles. I don't think Sam Darnold's coming back, although that would be wild if he ends up back in the Jets.
That's what I'm rooting for. I think that would be great.
Yeah, it would be great if it happens. It seems unlikely, but with a new franchise and leadership and a new direction, you can't count it out. I just think that it seems likely that they get a bridge, and with their goal being that whether it's like a Jalen Milroe out of Alabama or someone like that who could be starting by the end of the year. And look, Jets fans are used to having rough years. I think this year is likely to be a rough year. But if you want to be optimistic, you look at what Washington did. You look at what Bo Nix did. You looked at how ready Michael Penix Jr. looked by the end of the year. We have this belief going in that, oh, this class is not great. And no, it's not Caleb Williams, it's not Jaden Daniels, and it's not Drake May. And even the Jets are not going to get one of the top 2 picks. I also think that we often don't understand what guys can do at the next level until they get there, especially the quarterbacks who come in with a large degree of college experience and a lot of games starting under their belt, and just that mental bank of having seen all of these different coverages and disguises that they can pull upon when they get to the NFL. So I think that is I understand that we need the predictions. I also think that the Jets probably don't know what they're doing yet. I would be shocked if they did. Yeah. And if the Jets think they know what they're doing right now, that's actually the problem. Yeah,
I think that's a problem. Like, I sit here, I say, I don't have a good answer for you. I can't tell you, and I don't think the Jets do either.
But Frank, I actually think the problem would be if the Jets did have their answer now, because then you're making a rash decision and you haven't done all the homework yet. This is a group that even if Darren Mugie in Denver was scouting quarterbacks to some degree, which, by the way, you got to give him some credit. He was part of the group that found Bo Nix. He might not have been the scout, and it's never just one person. But I think that there is a reason so many people from the Denver coaching staff, as well as the Denver front office staff, got hired this offseason. And it's because of what they did with that quarterback, finding Bo Nix. And Sean Payton is a huge part of that. We can't underrate that, especially in terms of the play calling. But I do think that there was an element of, hey, you saw this process work. And I think we've talked to some degree, but let's just say it wouldn't surprise me if Caleb Williams was not top 2 on the Broncos draft board and if they didn't have him top 1. And so I think that when you look at their belief in certain quarterbacks who had a lot of success this season, and I would say the 2 quarterbacks who had the most success as a rookie, it might have been the 2 quarterbacks that the Broncos actually liked the most. I think that you have to give them a little bit of credit that as they go through the course of this process, you can figure it out. I'm not saying they will, but they can. Also, you're bringing someone in with Garrett Wilson. You're bringing someone in with a great defense. Like, there are a lot of pieces. The best thing you can do to support a rookie quarterback is not ask that much of them, is be able to say, we have an offensive line, which the Jets need to upgrade, to be clear. We have a running game. They have that with Breece Hall among their other guys. And we have a defense. I mean, that's why when you're going back to what we talked about with Cleveland last week and Myles Garrett, the reason you don't trade Myles Garrett is not because you think you're going to win a championship this year. It's because you think that if you are trying to best support a rookie quarterback, having a defense that is consistently getting more possessions for the offense and a strip sack and another possession here in a short field, that's what you want for your young quarterback. And the Jets do have that infrastructure.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll have a lot of time to talk about the Jets this offseason. Let's actually talk about a team that's good. We'll come back after this ad break and talk about the Super Bowl. All right, Jori, we had a fun week in New Orleans. I'd like to say that our good friend, coworker Jason Fitz picked up the flu in New Orleans this past week. So somebody had a worse week than the Chiefs, at least. Wishing all the best of Fitz. That's why he's not here today. Get better, my friend. What were your impressions of the Super Bowl itself? I mean, just it has to start with, wow, Eagles. I don't think, look, as I pointed out many, many times, as you chided me online about, I was the only one at Yahoo Sports to pick the Eagles to win, but I'd be lying if I thought that was going to happen.
Yeah, Frank, I'm really impressed that you made it nearly 20 minutes of this recording before
I know, right?
gloating about the Eagles.
Could we reshoot the opening? Because I really should have started with, hi, I'm Frank Schwab, the only person at Yahoo Sports to pick the Eagles. That's just how I'm going to be all offseason.
It's an honor to be here with such an esteemed host today, Frank. But I think when I look at it, on Thursday when we were talking about this, I said, look, the Eagles are a more talented team, but the more talented team does not always win in the Super Bowl because the clutch gene matters and just all of these different things of variability. You could say officiating. I don't want to get into those conspiracies, but a lot of elements other than just talent go into winning, particularly in the postseason. But in this game, the more talented team won. And I actually think that the score gap reflected the talent gap. What amazes me is that you come into the season, the Buffalo Bills looked like a powerhouse. The Baltimore Ravens looked like a powerhouse. The Kansas City Chiefs looked like a powerhouse. All of these AFC teams, I mean, even in some ways on offense, especially the Cincinnati Bengals, among others. Now, maybe you could say the Lions on the NFC side, but who would have really thought that the NFC team, regardless of which NFC and AFC team we're going up against this, would win in the Super Bowl? That's what amazes me. But when you look at it, I mean, on one hand, it's, hey, this offensive line wasn't ready to support Patrick Mahomes. And it's interesting. Actually, this is a great conversation that I want to have. I was talking to someone in the Bengals organization at the Senior Bowl, and I was talking with them about Joe Burrow. And I was like, what do you think worked? Because so many people, you could draft the first overall pick, get a quarterback, and it doesn't always work. And the way that this person described it to me was, when you look at the pressure that Joe takes, and when you look at all the sacks he takes, and often it's, the offensive line. Well, how much is on him? How much is on the offensive line? One of the ways that Joe Burrow likes to play football is by taking as much of the rush as possible, because the more guys he has coming to him, the fewer defenders are downfield, and the more he's able to throw to his guys without having to worry that a defender is going to be in that midst. So he's like, I want the pressure so that downfield, I don't have to worry about the guys there. I think that Patrick Mahomes also thrives in that environment, and he did not have that environment in the Super Bowl. The Eagles were able to consistently to get pressure on him, to sack him 6 times, the most in Patrick Mahomes' pro career, without ever blitzing. They did this with a 4-man defensive front.
Craziest story.
It's crazy. I mean, kudos to Vic Fangio, kudos to Howie Roseman for getting a defensive group that was cohesive and talented enough to do that. But that, to me, was the number one story of this game, is the pressure that they got on Patrick Mahomes.
Yeah, you're right. And I mean, it wasn't just, I think it's kudos to Howie Roseman and the Eagles with this. It wasn't Nolan Smith. It wasn't Jalen Carter. It was Milton Williams, Josh Sweat. Like, they just kept coming in waves. Like, it's like, how many pass rushing defensive linemen do the Eagles have? Like, everybody's searching for them. And there's just an assembly line in Philadelphia. It was very, very impressive the way they played. And as I'm sitting there watching the Eagles just absolutely just demolish the Chiefs, like, it's shocking. And by the way, I'm going to make a lot of jokes this offseason about picking the Eagles, but it was one of those things where I talked, it was weird. I talked there's receipts if you go back and listen to Inside Coverage, where I was just like, why are we talking more about the Eagles? This team ended up winning 16 of its last 17 games. Like, the only one they lost was when Jalen Hurts got concussed in the first quarter against Washington. And even that game, Devontae Smith catches a third down pass, which he catches 99 out of 100 times. The Eagles win that game, and they run the table for 4.5 months. So I was just shocked that the Eagles didn't get more respect during the season, but now they are. And as this game is going on, I'm thinking, like, are we watching? And look, this is, I get it, a very, recency bias type of thing. Are we watching the dynasty torch being passed in front of our eyes here? Because when you look at this Eagles team, look, and it's happened from the Patriots to the Chiefs. This happens a lot in the NFL, actually. If you look at the history of the NFL, and this is why I wrote for my way too early power rankings, it's, if you could draw a line from the 60s Packers, 70s Steelers, the 49ers in the 80s, you get the Cowboys in the 90s, you go to the Patriots, you go right to the Chiefs. There's usually a dynasty. Are the Eagles our new dynasty? This was the youngest defense in the NFL, and they were awesome. And they're obviously awesome in the Super Bowl. A lot of the Eagles' offense is ready to go, still in their primes. They don't lose a lot this offseason as far as, like, free agents go. Yeah, they have Zach Bond, and I'm sure they would like to get him back. He's going to be expensive. We'll see there, but not anything I don't think they can absorb. And we know how he's going to add guys because he's been just on this amazing heater in the draft. Do we think we saw, like, this Eagles team, other than about a 7-week stretch in the 2023 season where everything just collapsed? They went to the Super Bowl, lost it in the final seconds by 3 points. They started the next year 10-1. This year, they were one of the most dominant teams in the NFL and had one of the great all-time Super Bowl performances. This kind of looks like the start of a dynasty. Do you agree with me that maybe we wake up in 4 years and everybody hates the Eagles because they can't stop winning?
Right. To me, one of the marks of the dynasty also is, can you beat other dynasties? And when we were talking to Eagles team owner Jeffrey Lurie after the game and after the post-game celebrations, and all the music had been blaring and the cigar smoke was very much in my hair for an hour, and I know we'll get to that locker room situation, Jeffrey Lurie was talking about Howie Roseman, and he described him as a future Hall of Fame general manager. And it wasn't an exaggeration. And when you look at one of the reasons why, in addition to just his general success and how much he sustained it, this Eagles team, and I say this Eagles team meaning the franchise and Howie Roseman and Jeffrey Lurie, because different head coaches, different quarterbacks in their last 2 Super Bowl victories. But in the decades since Howie Roseman was fired, 8 years, 3 Super Bowl appearances, 2 wins. They beat Bill Belichick, Tom Brady, and the Patriots, and now they beat Andy Reid, Patrick Mahomes, and the Kansas City Chiefs. I mean, who does that? Beat both of these powerhouses. And so when you look at this Philadelphia team, to me, what's amazing is that they have core pieces they're going to build around, But one of the reasons that the Chiefs lost was because the Chiefs' goal was stop Saquon Barkley. They did it. The Eagles' goal was stop Patrick Mahomes, and they did it. But the Eagles didn't rely on Saquon Barkley as much as the Chiefs relied on Patrick Mahomes. And so the Eagles built this team that, I mean, we call it whack-a-mole, we call it pick a poison, we call it, hey, Jalen Hurts had all of his metaphors of water the grass in different areas and different tools in the toolbox. I could go on and on. Jalen Hurts loves him a good metaphor. But when you look at it, they had so many different ways to win and so many different talents. Great, sell out against Saquon, which again, to be clear, Saquon had 97 yards from scrimmage, but if you look at his yards per carry, they were about half of what they were the rest of the season. They were able to stop their best player, and it didn't matter. The Eagles still had a rout. I mean, they were up like 34-0 before Saquon made any meaningful impact in the game.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, again, I'm going to pat myself on the back a lot, but that's one reason I picked Jalen Hurts to win MVP, because I thought the Chiefs were going to take Saquon out of the game. Spagnuolo hasn't allowed a 100-yard rusher in however many playoff games in a row. And they had the talent to say, we're going to take Saquon out of the game. But I thought when the chips were down, Jalen Hurts could make plays, and he did. A very impressive performance by him. We forget, like, this guy almost won MVP 2 years ago, right? Like, he's not a slappy. Like, he's a very good quarterback, and I think he showed that. One thing you mentioned that I want to touch on real quick before we get to the next topic. I think part of the reason I kind of like the Eagles getting on a roll here is they don't play in the AFC. The Chiefs, to make it back to the Super Bowl, the Chiefs are going to have to beat Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, Joe Burrow, even some of these up-and-coming teams, the Chargers, the Broncos, whatever CJ Stroud, if he rebounds in year 3. There's not that in the NFC. Like, I guess things can change in a hurry, and maybe the Packers come out of nowhere, or whoever, pick your team. Maybe this 49ers rebound, we've kind of forgotten about them. But don't you think that plays into this too? When you look at the shape of the 2025 season, the Eagles are clearly the NFC favorite, where the Chiefs, they've beat all these great AFC teams before, but it ain't easy. It ain't easy to run that gauntlet.
I definitely think the Eagles should be around for a while and be here to stay. I think that when I look at who's most likely to knock them off, the San Francisco 49ers to me are still going to be a problem. If they can stay healthy, I mean, I look at what happened to them this year, and they had insane amounts of injuries at running back, at receiver, all sorts of positions. I still think they are going to be an issue. I would think Detroit, but I actually don't know. I'm less confident in Detroit than San Francisco.
Right. It's hard because they're coordinators. We underrate that so much.
1,000%. And that's one of the reasons that it's so impressive with Philly, because among the Chiefs' advantage and their edge is Andy Reid's been their offensive play caller for years, and Steve Spagnuolo-Spags has been their defensive play caller for years. The Eagles just keep losing play callers, but also if you're Jalen Hurts, I mean, I have to add up the numbers now because I did a story on him a few years ago when it was 7 play callers in 8 years. And I think he's about to be up to 10 play callers in 9 years or something like that, because he's just got a new one every single year. But the Eagles are willing to, I think, whereas the Chiefs have avoided a lot of the turnover, the Eagles have created the system that has so many different elements to pull from that they can withstand the turnover, I think. We will see. But you also have to remember that it's not accurate to say that the Eagles had a down year last year. They spiraled at the end of the year. They had culture issues at the end of the year. They won 10 straight last year. It was 10-1 that they started the season. I mean, this is still a team that has won an insane number of games. Nick Sirianni's breaking all these records for his winning record or winning percentage. So This is a team that has consistently won. And when I was reading the Sports Illustrated cover story by Greg Bishop, who's a great reporter over there, he had this great paradigm where Jalen Hurts' fiance had written him a letter, and it was talking about how improving is beating yourself, winning is beating your opponent. And Jalen really took that paradigm and said, what's the difference between improving and winning? And he is the son of a coach. His father is a tough coach. I've talked to Averian. And Jalen's whole thing was, how can I always get better? How can I always be reflecting that I'm getting better in practice in the game? Not just to prove to someone, but you want to be getting better. And he shifted his paradigm this year to say, even if I am not demonstrating that personal improvement in terms of my play, if we're winning, that's what matters. And that's hard for players, because if you're any player on the team, and especially the quarterback, when you're expected to be the leader physically and emotionally of the team often, you think you have to play at your best level and you have to perform and be the most productive. I mean, again, this goes back to, and we can talk about this if you want, why I voted for Lamar Jackson, first team All-Pro, but Josh Allen for my MVP vote, because I thought that the difference between value and production is not the same. Different teams ask different values of different players. But when you look at what Jalen Hurts said, he basically said, I don't need to be the most productive person on the team if we can win. And they did. This was Saquon Barkley saying, okay, I want to rush for the most yards in NFL history after I passed 2,000. But what if we win a Super Bowl instead? Yeah. And at the time I was like, well, that kind of sucks if they don't win a Super Bowl. But they did. And watching Saquon celebrate, I was in the Eagles post-game locker room and watching Saquon just dancing.
Shotgun
and,
beers? Did you
yeah,
see shotgunning
beers?
I want to ask you, no, let's go to that real quick, because I did want to get to this. You went to the locker room. I stayed by the podiums and stuff after the game because I was waiting on Sirianni, who we'll talk about in a little bit. What was the scene like in the Eagles locker room? the video of Saquon shotgunning beers, which, by the way, is not a skill I have. I don't think you've shotgunned many beers in your life. So
I have not. I'm allergic to beer.
I didn't think so. Yeah, allergic. Yes, that's right. Yeah. So I did not think that's something you did very often. But just give me the scenes for the Eagles locker room. What did you like the most? What did you take out of there? It's always interesting being in the winning or losing locker room after a Super Bowl.
Yeah, I was actually excited because this is the 5th Super Bowl I covered. In 3 of them, I didn't go to locker room at all. I just went to podium because, like, for our listeners who aren't familiar with this, the podiums are usually in a regular season game, like 2-minute walk roughly from the locker room. Here, it's like 15-minute walk.
The other end of the stadium,
if you're me, I always wear tennis shoes and literally sprint down the tunnels of the stadium to try and make it between places. So I'd been to the post-game locker room once. I believe it was Chiefs in Miami several years back at the very end, but I had missed the celebrations. And so this time I was like, no, I'll get the podium quotes, but I want to be there for the scene. It was insane. I mean, the lights were flashing. It was like disco strobe type lights. You had rap music blaring. All of these players were wearing the champagne Oakley goggles. I had to look up, like, why do people celebrate with ski goggles? And I learned that it's a champagne goggles thing. So that was a new learning for Jori Epstein this weekend. And then you have guys massive champagne bottles in one hand, a cigar either in the other hand or between their teeth. I mean, Jalen Hurts walks in and he's a bit late to the celebration because he had all his media responsibilities, and he's got the cigar between his teeth, the beer can in his hand. He just starts dancing through the circle and just douses Saquon with that beer. And then you've got guys, the Lombardi trophy. What I actually loved, and I wrote about this, is I've been in locker rooms where win celebration or lose comforting, the receivers are comforting each other, celebrating together. The quarterbacks are doing something. The coaches are doing something in the front office. That was not how this was. Howie Roseman was dancing with the secondary. Jeffrey Lurie and A.J. Brown were dancing together with the Lombardi trophy. You have Jalen and Saquon dancing, and then you have Jalen go hug Zach Bond, and then you have, hey, this defensive tackle and this cornerback. It was such an integrated celebration, and I think that really reflects why this team won. You can say that it sounds cheesy when Nick Sirianni is preaching his togetherness, but we talked about this a minute ago, whether it's Saquon not going for that rushing record or Jalen not getting the passing numbers he had, or, hey, one defender doesn't get all of the takeaways because they're all kind of taking turns who got it. That's how this team won, is by having so much talent and being willing to let other players showcase it. I know A.J. Brown made one comment, I think it was after the Carolina game, about the passing game needs to get better, which I actually don't think he meant as critically as people took it. But this was a team that had to let everybody else have their moments so that ultimately, when they got to the postseason, they could convince opponents that blocked someone else who had their moment, and that was it. The first play of the Washington game, if you remember, the Eagles' first snap in the NFC title game, Saquon had that 60-yard touchdown. And you can say what you want about a defender tripping another, someone missing a tackle, but a big reason that happened was because they ran this dummy call where they said, hey, we've already faced the Commanders twice this season. They know our tendencies, especially a guy like Bobby Wagner, who probably studies film as well as anyone could study film. They know certain things that are going to happen. So why don't we make this look that we've seen they're going to be ready for, and then switch up the call based off it. And so they did that. And one of the reasons, I've talked to Eagles linebacker Zach Bond about what an awesome feel it is when he knows the film study so well that he can just shoot the gap and tackle Derrick Henry, and one example, and other players and others for a tackle for loss. And so they basically tricked the Commanders into thinking they were going to have that clean of a read and then did a different play off of it. And that's what this team does, is you say in the NFL, you want to set up tendencies and then break them. And they had so many different tendencies that I don't think Jalen Hurts was incapable of having the passing and running game that he had on Sunday in all of the prior weeks. I think he was just willing to say, and definitely with some frustration and pushback, fine. If we win, fine, I'll do it. Now, if we start losing, I might go rogue. And as he said to Nick Sirianni, let me out of my straitjacket. But if we're winning, fine, you can have this game plan.
Absolutely. One thing that got brought up often, more than I thought during Super Bowl week, there was a kind of a theme with the Eagles, and you've probably heard this being around that team a lot, especially in the postseason, is that all the Georgia guys they have on defense. I mean, obviously everybody is noticed and made the jokes and talked about how Howie Roseman kept drafting guys from that University of Georgia defense. But the players and Sirianni and all that said that togetherness that group had was kind of infectious in the whole locker room. That brought the chemistry together. Do you think that had an impact? And look, this isn't something you could really replicate. Like, there's very few times that an entire defense is basically NFL caliber. Like, you're not going to go and say, we're going to draft all of UCLA's defense and figure this out. Like, that doesn't happen very often. So I'm not saying other teams can follow this blueprint, but how much do you think that this is a thing? I mean, they kept citing it all week, that the Georgia guys on defense and how together they were rubbed off on the whole team.
I do think it rubbed off. And I think, again, getting guys to buy in that there is a bigger goal than themselves, it's so much easier said than done. And it sounds cliche. And I also think when we talk about what is a head coach doing if they're not calling plays, first of all, Nick Sirianni does have fingerprints on the offensive game plan and on the defensive, to be clear. But I do think there's this messaging and there's this motivation that is his ultimate job. And I also believe that you can say what you want about feeling that Nick Sirianni is not always mature and he doesn't always control his emotions. But first of all, this is the city of Philadelphia we're talking about. The city of Philadelphia is a passionate city, not a city that controls its emotions. And I also still believe that the Eagles just were like, oh, okay, if Nick can be himself, then maybe we can be ourselves too. Okay, if Nick is going to take that criticism away from us, well, then we don't have to worry about people being like, you can't run and you can't pass. No, because Nick's actually going to be the one taking this. So I definitely think it was a big deal. And I also think you got to give credit to Nick for hiring the coordinators he had. I mean, you have to remember that Kellen Moore interviewed for the head coaching job when Nick Sirianni did. So there are coaches who would say, I'm not bringing in an offensive coordinator who almost got my job, because then they might take my job, especially since everyone felt like Nick was on the hot seat after last season and even 4 or 5 weeks into this season. And he said, no, I'm down with that. I want that. I think he's the right offensive mind. Defensively too, Vic Fangio. I mean, when you look at what he did, I think that Nick Sirianni had the emotional intelligence to realize that while Vic Fangio wasn't the right defensive coordinator for Miami, and he was not right for the Miami culture, which is a very different culture than Philadelphia from a city standpoint and a franchise standpoint, he was right for this culture. And actually, I didn't realize this. I don't know if it's been reported, but Jeffrey Lurie was telling us on Sunday night that they actually wanted Vic Fangio the year prior before he went to Miami, and they tried to get him, but then they were in the Super Bowl that year. And it wasn't officially announced that Jonathan Gannon was going to get the Arizona job, so there was a chance they wouldn't lose their defensive coordinator. And so despite telling Vic, hey, if we don't have Gannon back, we want you, Vic ended up taking the Miami job because he wanted the certainty he would be a defensive coordinator instead of, hey, if this guy gets the job. So they actually felt like they should have had that 2 years ago. But you really got to give Philadelphia credit for understanding not only the schemes that would help their players succeed, but also what form and style of motivation from coordinators would help their team succeed.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to talk about Sirianni a little bit more because if there's anything I love, it's talking about legacies. We're going to take an ad break, come back, talk about what this means, what this win means to guys like Jalen Hurts and Nick Sirianni. All right, Jori, every Super Bowl matters a ton to the winning coach and the winning quarterback. That's just how it is. I know other guys like Vic Fangio, who I felt great for finally getting his ring. It matters to him and his legacy. Saquon Barkley moves up the list of all-time running backs with a Super Bowl ring, but not like quarterbacks, not like a coach. Let's start with Hurts because, I mean, a couple of years ago, Jalen Hurts had this magical season. He probably is going to win the MVP. If he doesn't get hurt late in the year and misses 2 games, it was going to be very close. He has a Super Bowl that I've talked about. I thought he should have been MVP off the losing team. That's how good he was. He was the best player in that game. And then it kind of like, he got his contract and it became lukewarm on Jalen, especially this year. But Jalen Hurts had the best passer rating of his entire career. He was just very efficient. And Saquon Barkley just kind of took over the offense because he's Saquon Barkley. Now that Jalen has this ring. And now you start looking at his career, and like, this dude is won a lot of games. He's affected winning in a lot of different ways. And you wrote about it. I thought this was just a very smart angle of, look, it's not all about passing yards for quarterbacks. It's about how they affect the game in different ways, whether it's their mental aptitude in figuring out a defense and how to beat it, whether it's Jalen Hurts running the ball. He was the leading rusher in this entire game. Like, he took over the game in that way, including his passing. Where do you think Hurts stands after this? Does he vault back up to that conversation he was in with the Burrows and the Josh Allens and Lamar Jacksons of the world? Or are we a step behind with Jalen? Does he need another ring to start? Like, where are we at with Jalen Hurts and kind of where he fits in the NFL hierarchy right now?
I'm glad you bring up 2 Super Bowls ago, Frank, because I think probably what I got most wrong in my prediction of this game is I thought ultimately Patrick Mahomes would win it and Jalen Hurts would not. But you have to remember that Jalen Hurts played better in the Super Bowl that the Eagles lost to the Chiefs than Patrick Mahomes did. And so
he's awesome.
The Chiefs didn't necessarily have the quarterback advantage. And Jalen Hurts has been on so many big stages from Alabama to Kansas City and beyond. Alabama to Philadelphia against Kansas City and beyond. I think that with Jalen Hurts, it's interesting because this is not just a media criticism problem. There are some people who the league is much higher on than the media. And I don't even mean media in the sense of reporters. I mean social media. I mean fan reaction. I mean the online conversations. For example, at training camp this year, I had a GM tell me, and multiple other executives agree with them at different stops, that they believe Sam Darnold still had what it took to be an NFL quarterback, but that the Jets had kind of ruined him, and that the Jets put on a clinic of how not to develop a rookie quarterback and onboard them and support them, and that Sam Darnold could play better than he had, and then he did. But both at the beginning of the season and at the end of the season this year, I had different GMs and executives telling me that the reason that the Eagles were such a run-heavy offense was because the Eagles understood that Jalen Hurts 2 years ago when they had the Super Bowl and he was a very prolific passer, that was an outlier year rather than the norm for him, and that's not who Jalen is. He's not actually going to be that good. And I think it's fair to say that he's not actually going to be that prolific a passer every year if they want to win. But I don't think it's fair to say that was an outlier in terms of how good he was. Good looks different for Jalen Hurts now than it did then. Good looks different depending on which guys he's had. The tush push is not about the offensive line only. And you could argue it might not be about the offensive line primarily. I think it's equal parts Jalen Hurts and the offensive line, because if it was just the offensive line, Jason Kelce, their star center, retired, and they did not have a drop-off. And so we've seen the numbers of what Jalen Hurts can bench and how strong he is and his legs and all that. But this is a group effort here. And so I think both when you look at the running, and which, as I wrote in my story, running is part of quarterbacking, making the decisions, understanding where the lanes are, understanding how to control the operation, and then ultimately take off. That is not separate from how Jalen Hurts quarterbacks. That is part of how Jalen Hurts quarterbacks, even if his passer rating and his traditional passing statistics don't reflect that. And then you add in the throws he was making. His throws were great on Sunday. Even some of the throws that weren't caught because of, A.J. Brown pushing off or et cetera, et cetera.
He did not. That was such a terrible call, by the way. That was such a terrible call.
I know, but the NFL got back for it. So,
it did, yeah.
I think he quarterbacked at such a high level. Where do you think he stands in terms of relative to those other quarterbacks?
And that's hard. It's really hard. I've thought about this a lot because, if you're just drafting a team today, I think you'd take guys like Burrow and all them. That top tier we know about. I talked about, and I'm probably wrong in retrospect, I talked about Jane Daniels as best quarterback in the NFC already. And you look back and you're like, well, that's kind of dumb. What about Jalen Hurts? Like, what else could he do? And it's just more flashy. And Jalen Hurts is not necessarily a flashy quarterback. And I think part of that goes back to just, he was a second round pick. And, that just sticks with people so long of like, you weren't like the guy coming out. We weren't all eyes on him as a rookie and all that. And I think that does work against him. The fact that he was benched in a national championship game. And he even talked about it after the Super Bowl, because I was in his press conference, that he's had an unprecedented journey, and he was very self-aware about it. He's like, nobody's had the journey I've had. And he's true in many ways. And I think that's part of the reason he gets undervalued a lot. And oftentimes running quarterbacks get undervalued a lot. I thought Cam Newton was undervalued a little bit during his career. And I think the same thing's happening to Jalen, because he's just a calm, steady guy. You look up at the end of the day and you're like, wow, he he really had a great game today, and he's not, making it all about himself a lot of times. And even the tush push, I mean, I don't think a lot of people just give the credit to Jalen Hurts. They give the credit to the Eagles, like you kind of mentioned this. But when you have a guy who is 93%, whatever they are in short yardage situations, do you have any idea, like people, how much of an edge that is? Where they get, Jahan Dotson was ruled down at the 1 yard line in the Super Bowl. All of us, everybody in the Superdome was like, well, it's in. Jalen Hurts is going to score a touchdown here. There's no other play. There's no other team like that where you were at the 1 yard line. We've seen teams struggle for the 1 yard line. We saw the Buffalo Bills do it in the AFC Championship game, okay? The Philadelphia Eagles are so automatic at that, and that's such an edge for them, and Jalen Hurts deserves credit for that, but it's such a that's not a Jalen Hurts play. They're just pushing him forward. Well, nobody else can do it. So I just look at Jalen Hurts. He's almost destined to be a little bit underrated until we look up in 3 years, as we talked about. Maybe this is the next dynasty. They're certainly set up for it. Maybe we look up in 3-4 years and we're like, wow, Jalen Hurts was so close in that one Super Bowl, and now he's got 3 more rings. I mean, I think this could be his career path where he's kind of undervalued during his career, but at the end of it, you're going to be like, wow, that dude won a lot of games, and he had a lot to do with them winning games.
That's a good distinction. I think oftentimes we don't appreciate what we're seeing until afterward when we see it, especially if, people watch NFL quarterbacking thinking that Patrick Mahomes throwing with his left hand or having some crazy, how did it even get there when it just was a flick of the wrist and then all of a sudden it was a throw, that's the theatrics they like to see, or Saquon Barkley having that backward hurdle. But the reality is, even what Jalen is doing to escape the pocket, and there's both escaping within the pocket, or moving around within the pocket and escaping without of it. If Patrick Mahomes had the mobility that Jalen Hurts had, the game would have looked different on Sunday. Now, I'm not saying the Chiefs would have won, but the biggest issue Patrick had is his offensive line could not handle the Eagles' defensive line. He had no time to throw. His receivers didn't have time for their routes to develop. And then all of a sudden, it's sack, interception. It's a strip sack. It's, another interception by Zach Bond. All of these things were happening. Well, Jalen Hurts counters some of that and neutralizes some of that, because he's able to escape, because he's able both to run and to escape and then throw on the run. And so, yes, you have to give the Eagles offensive line credit, but they don't win them all. They win a lot, but nobody wins them all in this league. And so it's really, and maybe 3 of them, if you do win them all, well, there's 5 of them that have to win them all to have the protection. And so there are a lot of ways that Jalen Hurts not only creates a +1 in terms of being a running and passer, but also in some ways is like a 6th offensive lineman in the sense that he can protect himself more than many quarterbacks can because of his mobility.
You know who Jalen Hurts kind of, when you project what his career might be, and it's going to be a weird comp to some people, but let me explain. I view him as almost Troy Aikman. Because back in the 90s, they're different players. Obviously, clearly, much different players.
I think I know where you're going. So
exactly. Where in the 90s, look, there were quote unquote better quarterbacks than Troy Aikman, right? Like Steve Young was there, Brett Favre. It was at the height of his powers, 3 MVPs. And Troy Aikman was with this great team, this unbelievable offensive line, this phenomenal running back behind him. But what Troy Aikman just did was win games over and over and over, win Super Bowls over and over. And you get to the end of his career and you're like, yeah, that dude's going to Hall of Fame someday. And I think Jalen could have the same type of career where we just sit here in the moment and say, oh yeah, Jalen makes plays, but 2,000 yards Saquon Barkley. Look at this defense, and that offensive line is unbelievable. And you're just going to get to the end of Jalen Hurts' career and say, that dude actually made a lot of plays and he won Super Bowls. I think it's going to be multiple too. I do think the Eagles are not done. I don't think they're one and done here. I think this is a team that could win more than one. And so I think that when we're looking at it, I think if Jalen Hurts, look, if he does win 3 Super Bowls like Troy Aikman did, he's going to Hall of Fame. Like that just is what happens. And that's why these games matter so much to legacies. And you look back, and again, him playing so well in that Super Bowl a couple of years ago is going to matter on his resume too. And so I can see him having kind of a Troy Aikman-esque legacy where no, he didn't win an NFL MVP. No, he didn't, blow anybody away with his stats. Maybe he wasn't the best quarterback necessarily of his generation. I think there were other guys better in that era, but you get to the end of the day and you're like, yep, that's a first ballot guy. I think that we could look back at Jalen Hurts having that kind of a career, different players, but similar legacies.
No, I think that's a good point, Frank. And I also think that your losses look different once you have that win. I mean, Kaylin Caller of ESPN did a story talking about Mahomes and the three-peat, and she talked to Troy Aikman and got quotes from Tom Brady as well about what the Super Bowl losses meant and how you view the different losses and wins on that stage and how Super Bowl losses look different than any other loss. And I know that sounds cliche, and of course everything looks different, but the way that, especially in a Hall of Fame candidacy, matters. And so when you look at the number, I mean, it's something like 4 or 5 quarterbacks ever have lost a Super Bowl and then come back and won another. Lost their first, then come back and won. And I think Jalen Hurts is something like one of 3 to lose his first Super Bowl and come back and win, because there is a psychological impact of losing a Super Bowl, being so close to the mountaintop and not getting there. And so when you now say, well, Jalen did get there, and the reason we felt like Mahomes could pull it out because he did, because he kept doing it and he had proven it. Once you've proven you can win on the Super Bowl level, your whole career is just in another stratosphere. And then you say, well, that first time, Jalen's performance was enough to win. Okay, he had a fumble. Well, look at all of the other things. No one's playing a perfect game here. And Jalen Hurts probably had the best game of anyone on the Eagles in the Super Bowl 2 years ago when they lost. And now, he's also one of their most valuable players, if not their most valuable player. I mean, you can argue between him and some of the defensive linemen in this game. And he won one. That combined Super Bowl performance, when you look at his stats between the 2 Super Bowl performances, I should have brought the numbers here, but I mean, it's pretty insane what he's got in 2 Super Bowls.
Yeah, what I'm basically saying through all this is Jalen Hurts is going to be Joe Buck's broadcasting partner in 15 years. That's what
no, he's not, though, because the way that he's not going to want to share the amount of information is that
so measured. Yeah. He is so measured. Let's talk about Nick Sirianni, because I sat there. Look, I mean, the bosses told me, hey, let's do something on Sirianni. I thought that's a good idea because of all he has been through. But as I sat there waiting for him, waiting a long time, actually, I kept thinking, like, what do I think of Nick Sirianni as a coach? This dude is 48-20 as a head coach with the Philadelphia Eagles. That is cooking. Like, that is an unbelievable record when you add on the fact that he almost won a Super Bowl and did win a Super Bowl. But I'm like, well, it was so weird. Like, he got a lot of his power stripped 13 months ago. They were sniffing around Bill Belichick. However, to what extent, we'll probably never really know. But Sirianni was almost fired. And if you look at the end of September, when they were 2-2, everybody wanted Sirianni gone. Like, a hot seat, they got to get rid of him and all this kind of stuff. Let's not change that narrative. That was out there. And so what do we think of Sirianni? What impact do you think Sirianni has had on this 48-20 record? What impact did he have on this unbelievable Eagles team that almost ran the table for 4.5 months to end the season? What do you think of him as a coach and kind of where he ranks in the NFL? Because I don't think we still view him as a Andy Reid type or these other guys who we know how they impact winning. Where are you on Sirianni? What do you think of him as a coach, and how much do you think he had to do with the Super Bowl championship?
I think that's the same way we say Jalen Hurts and the tush push is going to be impacted in terms of the amount of credit he gets because he has the offensive line and, he's throwing to A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith. Nick Sirianni is never going to get the full credit he probably deserves because Howie Roseman is such an impressive general manager getting him the talent that anytime you're starting with that degree of talent, you do have an advantage. But that doesn't, again, going back to the difference in most valuable player and best player, I don't know that he is the most valuable coach we see in the NFL because I think other coaches are asked to do more, both in terms of culture and schematics at the same time. But I do think when you look at Nick Sirianni and the culture he set, the same way that we're talking about Saquon not going for the rushing record and Jalen not lighting it up every game and A.J. Brown being a pretty good sport when he didn't get many targets in a lot of playoff games, that started with Nick Sirianni. As you mentioned, I mean, you called it getting some of the power stripped from him, but another way to put it is he was comfortable with and willing to let Kellen Moore take the reins on the offense, to let Vic
a guy who, like you said, interviewed for his job.
Kellen Moore, a guy who interviewed for Nick Sirianni's job, coming in, and Nick said, I'm not going to be threatened by them. I'm going to just put together the best powerhouse of people that I can to win this game. And I think that when players see coaches doing that, and by the way, Jeff Stoutland, the offensive line coach / running game coordinator, I don't think anyone on the coaching staff has a bigger influence on the offensive scheme than Jeff Stoutland. Now, others have similar, and there's a passing game coordinator, and there's an offensive coordinator, and there's a game plan. But in terms of the advantage they have, Jeff Stoutland's probably their most valuable coach, which is also why I'm like, I don't understand how no teams tried to steal him. I don't understand why people aren't stealing him as offensive coordinator, but that's another conversation. But I think at some point it's, okay, who cares? If Nick Sirianni were not a good coach, you cannot win the Super Bowl. I firmly believe you cannot win a Super Bowl with a bad coach. You cannot win a Super Bowl with an average coach. And you cannot even win a Super Bowl probably with a good coach. I think you have to be a great coach because of how much has to go right and how much you have to account for and how much you have to help navigate. And I do think that there's a level of Nick Sirianni calling players into his office just to check. Nick Sirianni checking on them when a parent is sick or when they're trying to start a family and fertility is challenging, or, hey, you're coming from a new team and are you learning the scheme? And wait, I've had agents tell me, my player was shocked that Nick called him into the office because he's like, I haven't even started a game yet. Why does he want to talk to me? Am I in trouble? And Nick just wanted to check on how he was doing. And at some point, that makes you want to play for the people around you because Nick is showing you he cares. And by proxy, the Philadelphia Eagles care about you.
You know, and one of the things, look, the Eagles kind of reverse engineered this, so it seems weird. But at the end of the day, they ended up with that CEO coach I really like. Like, there's some dudes out there who are just so adept at being play callers and coaches. Andy Reid, Sean Payton. They could do both jobs, right? And those guys are special. They're unicorns. But I think mostly the guy I want as a head coach, who I think there's a very successful model here, it's the Tomlins, it's the John Harbaughs, of Dan Campbell, another one, where my coordinators are going to call the game and I'm going to oversee everything. I'm going to set the culture. I'm going to be, obviously, like you said, caring for the players and what are they feeling and basically making sure everybody's not selfish around here. And I think Sirianni sets that tone of, he brought in an offensive coordinator who was interviewing for his job. He knows he's on the hot seat. And I think that he can look around at the locker room and say, look, guys, I'm all in for winning. We brought in Kellen Moore. He doesn't have to say this. They know this. They're very smart guys in the locker room. And so if you're A.J. Brown, who might not be putting up 1,600 yards like Jamar Chase, you could still say, well, my coach sacrificed. I could sacrifice too. And I think that's very important. One thing, I know you noticed this being around the Eagles for basically the entire month of January and definitely Super Bowl week, you notice the Eagles players saying Nick Sirianni's catchphrases over and over.
Yes, I'm so glad you brought that up, Frank.
Because
Schwab.
You can't be great without the greatness of others. I heard that from Nick Sirianni about 3 dozen times and from his players about 10 dozen times, right? You heard this many, many times. You can't do this unless you really respect and like your head coach.
Typically, head coaches speak before the locker room opens up or at the beginning of when locker room time is after a game. And so you hear the head coach, and then if you hear a player saying that, you'd be like, oh, my head coach just said that. The Eagles reversed it in their locker room because I've been at I was at all 4 Eagles playoff games this stretch, in addition to some regular season games. And they'll open up the locker room. Most players will talk, and then Nick Sirianni will talk after, and Jalen Hurts at the very end. And so it took me a little bit to realize, wait a minute, that thing that the player said Nick is saying, the player's saying it because they got it from Nick, not vice versa. Because of the chronological element of this, it took me a minute to realize. But his messaging really comes through. And I think there's some, you can't be great without the greatness of others. And there's some line about everyone has a role to play. You don't have to play someone else's role, but you have to play your role. And we can't do it without everyone's role. I mean, he has all of these lines and he just is so consistent in his messaging.
Yes, absolutely. Let's get out of here. Your legacy is complete, Jori. My legacy is going to be the only person at Yahoo Sports to pick the Eagles win the Super Bowl. By the way, the legacy of Stone, our producer, is he's doing God's work. Hat tip to Fitz. Hope you feel better, buddy. We will be back on Friday. Hopefully Fitz will be here. C-Rob will be here. I will not be here. I'm going to be on South Beach. I'm going to do some partying after the season is done. But we appreciate everybody listening to Inside Coverage. Please rate and review. Those guys will be back with you Friday. I'll be back whenever. I'm not sure. I might just have a Eagles parade myself for picking them. So have a great week, everybody. We'll see you again on Friday.